Welcome everyone. Welcome to Harvard Geography Colloquium, May 2016 edition. This is our last one of the spring, but we generally hold these during the academic year. So look for our website and our newsletter to resume the series starting again in September. Today I'm delighted to have Kelly O'Neill with us. She's a history professor here at Harvard and has done a lot with mapping and GIS. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. It is the end of the semester, and I know that I imagine most people's mental energies are kind of at an ebb. So thank you for being here, and I'll try to give you some colorful stories to keep you engaged. My plan for today is a little bit different than what I thought it was going to be earlier in the week. If any of you are World Map users, you know there was a little bit of a hiccup with World Map this week, and my original plan had been to do a lot more in interactive fashion with the maps that I've been developing as part of my historical GIS project. World Map came back up fully functional at about 11:42, this morning, which did not give me enough time to kind of re-upload my layers. So I have this is a little bit more static than I wanted it to be, but bear with me, and we can always, World Map is now functional, so we can jump back out to it and play around a little bit if you like. And it is the end of the semester as well. Please feel free to interrupt me at any point if there is anything that that's unclear. I really welcome your comments and feedback. What I want to do is basically take up this notion of the Russian Empire as an empire of Tsars and rivers, right? Rivers are one of the fundamental geographical features and historical features in Russian history. What I want to do is talk a little bit about that, just give you a little bit of evidence for that claim if you need to be convinced, and then show you a little bit about what I have been working on over the past few years as part of what I call the Imperiia Project, Imperiia being the Russian word for empire, and give you, go through a set of maps that I derived from one particular source that I found kind of fun to work with, and from which I derived some insights that I have found useful in my own work. So I'll be showing you maps of butter and what's the other good one? I think I have fish, the price of fish in the Russian Empire, good things like that to look forward to toward the end of the talk. So anyway, have all of you seen this image before? Okay, a few nods, great. A few nods and a few shaking of the head. This is a really iconic painting done by Ilya Repin in the late 19th century. It is the image of barge haulers on the Volga. The Volga is one of the largest and most important rivers in the current Russian Federation, and it was so in the Soviet period and in the Imperial period before that, and in the Muscovite period before that. And this is one of the most famous kind of visualizations of the situation of a large segment of the Russian population under Tsarist rule. So if you were to look, because it's the end of the semester, let me turn this onto you a little bit. Looking at this image, what is the message that it is conveying about the Volga and about the experience of this subject of the Russian Empire along the Volga? What does this evoke in you?
Bedraggled comes to mind.
Bedraggled, yes. That might even be a kind term to use, right? Bedraggled. I love this image. I mean, Jillian, you probably have all kinds of interesting things to say about this image, but this image, you have the barge haulers walking along the shore of the river. You can see that the banks are very, very flat, which is an important thing to bear in mind when you're talking about Russian rivers, because one of the things that happens with a great many continental rivers is that they actually shift and change with the season. from year to year, which makes it very difficult for imperial officials to track them down sometimes and to measure them and quantify them, which then in turn can make it difficult to map them if you're living in the 21st century. So anyway, bedraggled, downtrodden, there's a guy smoking a pipe back there. They have their bast shoes on. There's this one figure of the young boy who's in the middle, who's more kind of vertical. It looks like there's even light shining onto his face, and he's looking off in a different direction as if he thinks he might somehow escape the fate of being a barge hauler for the rest of his life.
Is that a profession, or is it
it's a social status? It's a status, essentially. Yeah, and he's probably not going to escape that for the rest of it. He might. It's possible if he goes and is conscripted into the Russian army. That's another happy fate that might befall someone in his situation.
Because they didn't have any mules?
Sorry?
Because there weren't any mules?
They had mule. I don't know a great deal about mules. They certainly had a lot of horses, but they didn't use them for this at all. They had a proliferation of available human labor, and this was something that was developed as sort of a social contract in the Tsarist period. So no, in fact, I've never seen an image or come across many mentions of horses being used to this purpose as they would have been along towpaths in other countries. You can see there is a steam ship in the background there. This one is under sail. You can see the dead fish in the foreground. And I think it's a great image to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about the mighty Volga, the great kind of hydrographic conduit to the mighty Russian Empire with all of its griminess and bedraggledness. It's kind of I think, helpful image to bear in mind as we move through this. So one of the things that Russian historians like to say make a lot of very bold and broad claims about the importance of space in Russian history. For example, if you ever took a course on Russian history, I'm sure that your professor said on the first day, Russia is vast. Or someone else has said that to you along the way, that Russia is just a vast, vast space. And oftentimes they leave it at that and don't do a lot more to really think through the implications of that. Another thing that they might have said to you is that, Russia is a riverine space, right? Lots of rivers, and rivers are really important for understanding the Russian economy. It's another kind of thing that gets said, and there's not a lot of careful, nuanced thinking about how that actually works, and not a lot of pushing on the role of rivers in Russian history. And that's something that I'm interested in doing. Rivers get a lot of play as channels of conquest, as potential boundaries with this ever-expanding Russian Empire. But there's a lot more to be said about rivers. Rivers in kind of cartographic history, the way that Russia was portrayed in the 16th, 17th century into the 18th century, rivers play a dominant role in the kind of Western European vision of what Russia was, what it looked like. This is from Johann Blau's Atlas Major from the middle of the 17th century. And this is his depiction of Moscovia, Russia as it existed. And you can see that essentially from the perspective of the most famous Dutch cartographer of his time, Russia is an area of rivers and little forested places. And if there's any settlement, the settlements are all arrayed along the rivers. For example, up there in the north near Arkhangelsk, those little texts you can see are describing little settlements. So that the river is the place where Russian civilization, such as it is located. Now, Russian statesmen understood the importance of Russian rivers, and as did those who were their neighbors. These three little images I'm going to show you are some of my favorite depictions of Russian rivers. There were atlases of each of the major rivers of Russia compiled in the late 17th, early 18th century. This is the atlas of the Dnieper River in modern-day Ukraine. Complete with great little cartouche and really careful documentation of the kind of shoals and the rapids that characterize the Dnieper River. And this one is really good for giving you a sense of how difficult it was to navigate the Dnieper River, all of those little circles being depicting obstacles in the way of any kind of ship that wanted to make its way along the rapids. And rivers got narrated by anyone who came to this part of the world in the 17th, 18th century. One of the very famous travelers to this part of the world was a man named Adam Olearius. And he published his account of his travels here in 1647. And don't worry, I'm going to skip to the 19th century really soon, but we're just wallowing in the 17th century for a minute here. Olearius was born in 1603. He was educated in Leipzig. He was an astronomer, geographer. I'm sure he's familiar to many of you. He wrote a description of Muscovy. And in that description, he explained that through the provinces of Muscovy flow many fine, long, navigable rivers. I may say indeed that the like can hardly be found anywhere in Europe. The chief of these rivers is the Volga, whose length from Nizhny Novgorod to the Caspian Sea we calculated as 500 leagues. He goes on to extol the virtues of other rivers, and then says at the end that many less important streams, of which we shall not speak, provide a livelihood to those who live along them, both by their convenience for trade and by their bountiful fisheries. It is worth noting that the sources of these rivers are not in mountains or hills, as is usual, but in fields, swamps, and sandy places. And this is actually a terribly important thing to know about Russian rivers, that they don't originate in great high mountain ranges, that they originate in swamps. Good to bear in mind. So, this is an 18th century, one of the first comprehensive systematic atlases of the Russian Empire, produced in 1745 by the Academy of Sciences in Russia. Moscow is here. This is a single sheet. And you can see here too, those thick black lines are rivers. Of course, rivers play a major role in the mapping of Russia by Russians, well, by Frenchmen and Germans who come to map Russia on behalf of the Russians in the 18th century. That's Moscow. And one of the arguments that people make is that Moscow, in a sense, is not truly the heart of Russia. The heart of Russia really lies to the northwest in the Valdai Hills. And they're, I guess, hills, but that's essentially the swampy, flat area where all of the great rivers of Russia originate. But that is the region that is kind of considered to be by some to be the heartland of the Russian environment, of the Russian geography, the Russian landscape. And there was a famous historian in the 20th century who made the argument that if you pay attention to this fact, you will understand everything there is to know about why the Russians seem to want to go out and conquer everyone from time immemorial and have this kind of in their DNA somehow to go out and expand to the boundaries of the Pacific and to the Vistula and Poland. Because they come from this area, so went this argument, anyone who lived here would naturally want to follow the course of all of these great rivers, north, south, east, and west, until you get to their mouths and conquer and govern all of those lands, all of the watersheds of those rivers. And so this central fact explains the expansion of Russia, according to one historian who wrote a very kind of polarizing view of Russian history. This is called the urge to the sea. So that's one way of understanding the importance of rivers. And you can take it or leave it, but rivers are terribly important for understanding flows of urbanization, the development of the Russian economy, such as it was in the 19th century, Russian expansion, it turns out, and all kinds of other things. And I don't need GIS to know any of that. So what do I need GIS for? Okay, so here is, in a sense, the vision of the importance of rivers that is most frequently encountered. That Russian rivers are important. Sure, there are lots of small, minor rivers everywhere in Russia and other places in the world, everywhere in the world. But Russia, in Russia, it's all about understanding the Dnieper and the Don and the Volga and the Dvina. These four rivers, it's all about the big rivers. And it's all about those big rivers because they are what connects the Russian Empire to its capitals in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And all you need to know about the Russian economy is that it's backward. It's predominant. I don't actually really mean this, but this is the kind of the things that are said. It's a predominantly agricultural economy, and all of the productive energy of the economy is sent along rivers and a little bit along roads, eventually along the railroads, but sent along rivers, channeled to Moscow and to St. Petersburg and to a few little Baltic ports, right? And eventually to Odessa, but basically to the center. So it's a very kind of center-dominated kind of narrative in Russian history, particularly about the development of the Russian economy. And that may or may not be true, but I think it's worth kind of exploring the possibility that there's more to say. Okay. So my vision of what we should be thinking about in terms of the landscape of the Russian economy and how it works looks a little bit more like this rather than like this. And I'll show you and I'll explain what I mean by that. So lots and lots of rivers looked at from a more democratic perspective, in a sense. All right. So the problem for anyone who wants to really think about harnessing the power of GIS and harnessing the power of the incredible material in the Russian archives, much of which the Russian Imperial Archive is like any other imperial archive. There's a clear spatial organization to imperial archives. Imperial bureaucrats were thinking in spatial units all the time. They're thinking about administrative units, about provinces and little sub-provinces and jurisdictions of all kinds. And that's how they organize their material. And there is an incredible amount of work that one can do if one could take that archival material and match it up with spatial data, do basic spatial joins and see what you get. So in a sense, that's why I started out with mapping a long time ago. So I've been working on this project, which I call the Imperiia Project. This is what it looks like at the moment on World Map. And we won't go to World Map now just because I'm not sure it's quite stable. Doing historical GIS work is necessary because, as many of you in this room know, there isn't a lot of historical spatial data that one can simply go out and download. You basically have to generate it on your own. The boundaries, the blue boundaries that you see here are the boundaries of the Russian Federation. There's fantastic spatial data available for contemporary states. The gray area that you see lying below it is the space of the Russian Empire. So you can see there's a mismatch between Russian data and the space that I am interested in mapping. So my solution, and some of you already know this, I'll go quickly through this, but I'm happy to talk about this at length. But my solution was basically to do an experiment, to take a historical atlas that was produced in the 1820s and use it as the foundation for my attempt to map a lot of economic and cultural data. So this is the atlas that I chose. It was produced by the General Staff of the Russian Army in the 1820s. And it is comprehensive. There's one sheet for every province in the empire. This is what the sheets look like. It's quite rare. And just to give you a scale of the information that it contains as justification. So after doing the georeferencing and feature extraction, this is what, in terms of spatial data, what it's yielded. So I have administrative boundaries and road networks and river networks and locations, according to this atlas, of over 13,000 settled places, villages and towns, and all kinds of things. So there are all kinds of questions that you might want to ask about how one goes about taking an atlas that was produced in the early 19th century, according to very different cartographic standards and techniques than we use now, stitching it all together, georeferencing it, how you deal with questions of accuracy and inaccuracy. These are all open questions, and I'm happy to talk about that. I've forged ahead and said, all right, this is actually I'm terribly interested in knowing how Russian officials actually mapped their empire, and this gives me one way to do that. And so this is the spatial data that I have been using to map a lot of the statistical data that I have been working on. Just to give you a sense, you can see the administrative boundaries, their road networks, settlement locations of all kinds, hydrographical features. Again, I'll skip over this. Georeferencing is a nightmare, but we overcame that problem. Stitch all the pieces together. This is what it looks like. Administrative boundaries, road networks, rivers. There's all kinds of stuff. And then, of course, you can drop away all the historical content and see what you get. And that brings me to giving you an example. Oh, I did want to say one thing. The problem with a lot of historical GIS work is that you go through an incredible amount of work to generate this spatial data. And essentially what I have are shape files that have been extracted from an atlas produced in the 1820s, which means that they more or less accurately allow me to do spatial analysis for data from the 1820s. In a sense, it's, the Russian Empire had the nasty habit of reorganizing itself all the time. So even its provinces would be reorganized, the boundaries would be redrawn, whole chunks would be cut off and put in other places, and they kept expanding and adding new pieces, Central Asia and the Caucasus. So, this data is great, but it's a start. It doesn't get me everywhere. The very concept of what a province is constantly changing. And this is not unique to the Russian case at all. Okay, so this is the kind of data that I'm working with. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of data that I've pulled together, this is just a sampling of the kinds of things that I've been mapping using primarily this atlas as my foundation. Postal road itineraries, the spread of learned societies. You can read through this. There's a lot of kind of economic and social information that I've been mapping and exists in various layers, and some of it's on world map and some of it isn't there yet, but it will be in the near future as I try to bring this opening kind of phase of my project to completion. And now let me just tell you a little bit about, just for kind of 5 or 10 minutes, about this little case study that I wanted to show you about how I used the spatial data that I have and the statistical data that was generated by this guy to push a little harder on the notion of what the economy of the Russian Empire looked like in geographical terms in the 19th century. So this is the material that I'm drawing from is this. It's basically a statistical data on river navigation and the transport of goods along rivers in the 19th century in 1872. The reason why I thought this was actually a really fun data set to work on is because a lot of the maps that one sees and the books that one reads don't take the river as the unit of analysis. They might describe the economy of a province or a region. They might describe the economy of a town. But they don't describe, at least in Russian history, they don't take the river as the organizational unit. And I think it's really interesting to think about rivers as kind of analytical units because they're the conduits of economic activity and various forms of mobility. So when I came across this source, I was really absurdly excited about it, thinking, all right, they actually are some poor schmuck, went through and compiled all of this data and by river and by province. And now I'm going to go ahead and map it and see what it looks like. So Pyotr Petrovich Semyonov, he has an even longer name, Tianshansky. He was a very, very well-known, very famous kind of explorer and geographer, man of letters in the second half of the 19th century. He's a huge name in Russian history in the second half of the 19th century, and he is essentially responsible for the production of this data. This, in case you want to see what Russian material looks like, this is the listing of the tables that are included in this data set. from which I extracted all my stuff. So the data here describes variations in water levels along rivers, the volume of water in Russia's navigable rivers and lakes, the locations of rapids and dams, the volume and value of goods that are traded along them. They give you the day of the year on which the ice melts on each of the rivers to make them navigable. This was really important information that was captured annually if possible. So there's all kinds of really great stuff and interesting questions you can ask about seasonality and variation across space, just coming from this material. Just so that you know what you're looking at, the maps that I'm going to show you, which are, they're not beautiful, but they get the point across, I hope. Just in case you want to know what you're looking at, they are going to be overlaid on that atlas. There will be a layer that's going to have the administrative boundaries. I gave the projection information in case you are interested, and then you'll have the material on top of that, just so that you know what you're looking at. And they're all essentially going to look like this. I tried to keep it a little coherent. So here's my short version of what one learns by mapping a set of statistical information about Russian rivers from 1872. The first thing you learn is that Russian rivers are really complicated, and that not all rivers even qualify essentially as rivers from the point of view of a Russian bureaucrat. There are rivers upon which you could float timber that actually constituted a category of river. And there were rivers that were navigable by hauling using human labor, barge haulers. So again, back to that image I showed you in the beginning. So those were kind of the two main categories of rivers. So the problem here is that if you're thinking about what actually is considered a river, in the 1870s, it's actually a difficult thing. If you are a bureaucrat trying to do this, you have to contend with the fact that, a tiny little body of water in a dense forest upon which you could float a log would constitute a river, even though it might actually only be available seasonally and might be very short and very, limited in lots of other ways. Whereas something that might actually look more like a river upon which one could not float timber would belong to an entirely different category. It's very typically Russian bureaucracy approach to doing these things. But the whole idea of what a river is gets to be very complicated. Then you can see the one is highlighted. This is the ones where you could float timber, and these are the ones where you needed barge haulers.
And that's just Western?
Yeah. It got a little hard to fit them all.
Is it the Ural Mountains?
Yeah, this goes to
the right?
On the right, yep.
Okay.
Yep, so you have what officially constitutes the western portion of the Russian Empire depicted here. And I will apologize to anyone who's a fan of Siberia.
The categorization you have at the bottom of square Bureaucracy of river length, is that the area that they drain or what?
Oh, that is because the colors, the color layer, the chlorophyll layer there is showing you what they described as the river density. So they calculated, the density of river per square verst of area within every province. So if you see an area that has a deep blue, that means it's a province that had a high density of rivers. And if you see the red here, where you're moving out toward the more arid portion of the steppe in Astrakhan and beyond, doesn't have a lot of river density. There's a whole lot of water up there in the north along the White Sea, but those are huge provinces, and it turns out their river density looks low, even though there's a whole lot of water there.
Not flowing.
It is not flowing for most, exactly, right? So what actually is water? Anyway. Right, so let me skip right over that. And okay, so there's the river density without all the other stuff on top of it. So here's what the kinds of things that the data shows. again, the main narrative is that the Russian economy is dominated by the Volga and it's dominated by Moscow. And those are essentially the things that you need to know about the Russian economy. Sorry, I'm trying to go back and forth between two computers here. There we go. This map shows, I think, how easy it is once you begin to kind of press on the data to look at it a little bit more carefully and introduce a little bit of complexity into our understanding of what constitutes river and riverine trade, that you see something very different. So here you see the share of total volume, which is measured in poods, that's the unit of measure, of trade that was conducted along Russian rivers during those years over that three-year period. So here you can see that the Volga, which is right here, the width of the line tells you how much volume there was. That was clearly the main conduit of trade, right? There's nothing terribly surprising here. And this is the share of the total value. If you look in terms of the value instead of the volume of trade, it's even clearer that the Volga, of course, is terribly, terribly important. So nothing terribly surprising here. But if we shift things a little bit and look at, oh wait, we're not shifting yet. Okay, average price so average prices along the rivers. So the question is, does the Volga remain kind of unique according to every kind of different variable that one can measure? And in a sense, it's not. Here you can see that the highest price, if you're averaging the price per pood per volume of all the goods along the river, the highest price you're going to pay is here, not along the Volga, closer to the border with Poland. You see the same information here overlaid on population density. So you can start thinking about the relationship between population density and riverine trade. Total trade, okay. Revenues generated and volume. Okay, so right, so very clearly that's, again, another way of looking at the fact that the Volga is terribly important. So there's another way of looking at the data. Hopefully we'll get to it right here. Grain and spirits. Russians are famous for drinking a lot of vodka, right? In part, that's because they grew a lot of grain. They had a lot of agricultural production, and a lot of it was transformed into vodka. So grain and spirits were very important in the Russian economy, terribly important. In fact, every Russian revolution has to do with what happens with control over grain and vodka. So here you can see that the trade in grain and spirits, the total value, the Volga is basically, the story. It's dominating the story. If you look, this is where it gets more interesting. Thank you. Finally, I have my map. If you look instead at the unit of each individual river, if you think about how much along this river, how much of the trade along that river was conducted in grain and spirits. So you're looking at that level instead of looking at the total volume of trade, you begin to see that grain and spirits, sure, the Volga is the most important for understanding how much grain goes where. But if you look at the level of the individual river, you see that almost everywhere throughout the empire, grain and spirits are terribly important, right? So then the question is, does that hold true for butter and fish and tallow and furs? And don't worry, I won't show you all of those things. But just to give you a sense of how this kind of begins to shake out, you begin to see that, the trade in salt looks one way. If you look at the role of salt within rivers, so yes, the most flows along the Volga. But if you're looking at the role played by salt in each individual river, you see that it's terribly important, actually, up in the Russian north, and it's terribly important here along the Dnieper River. And of course, you might then start asking yourself why that is and where are the salt lakes and all kinds of things.
And do you know why it's so important in north?
There are a lot of salt sources there.
Okay.
So there's, so a lot of this has to do with the geography of natural resources.
So it's the main production. Right? Okay.
Yeah. Yep. It's very much tied to the regionality of natural resources. Yeah. Salt, and so here comparing salt. So salt is, relatively important in lots of places in the empire, whereas the production of the importance of metals and its its movement along rivers is not terribly important in many places, and that shouldn't shock us because we know that there's not a whole lot of industrial activity going on. But one might ask why these particular locations are interested in metal. Here's butter and tallow. So the total value, of course, the Volga is terribly important. But if you're looking at the role of butter as a trade within each river, you can see that, there's a lot of parity going across. There's a lot of trade in butter going on all of the Russian rivers. And one of the last things I wanted to show you is the timber trade. This is another one of the kind of cores of the Russian economy in the 19th century. And the question here too is it again the case that the Volga dominates? And if so, is there anything more interesting to think about here? So the squares show you the places where timber was unloaded from boats, and the circles show you the places where timber was loaded onto boats. The green layer underneath shows you the percentage of land within the province that was devoted to forests and timber. So then you can start thinking about the relationship between where the forests are and where the rivers are, where supposedly trade in timber is most important, and where the actual wharves are, where the timber is being loaded and unloaded within the empire. And this kind of thing is terribly interesting to me because it gets us to a point where we can start thinking at a more micro level, kind of zooming into a different scale of the Russian economy and thinking less about the kind of grand claim that, yes, the Volga is always important and there are forests in the north, and thinking a little bit more carefully about the smaller landscapes, the smaller scales at which particular forms of economic exchange are happening. Those little green lines.
I've got a question.
Yes.
And timber partly illustrates this. From your introduction, you're saying a lot is flowing inward into the continent as opposed to outward.
Yeah.
When you assign the trade, is it along the length of the river? And do you also have directionality to the direction the trade flows?
It's a great question. There's no directionality in the data. So I can almost always, I could assign it actually. I would be introducing that, but I can almost always assign it because I have other information. It's almost timber trade in particular is always going to go to the Baltic port, Russian shipyards that lay actually in the south, that are floating their flotillas down to the Caspian and to the Black Sea. So they're going to very particular locations. But in almost every case, I have enough information from other sources that would allow me to assign directionality. It's not here in this data, but yes, that is there. And timber is an interesting one because in some particular grades of timber are being exported, but anything that could be used to build a ship is staying within the empire. Yeah.
I think you could say if you have data that says the production of butter in a particular province is not very high, but there's a lot of trade, then it's probably trade in as opposed to trade out. Production butter is high, then the chances are that they're giving it away somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that is the kind of intuition that one would think would be borne out by the data every time. The problem is that it's awfully hard to find the actual evidence that will actually substantiate the claim at the level that you'd like to, the one would like to make it. But I think you're absolutely right. We have kind of very anecdotal, it's a lot of work to pull that kind of fine grain of data where it's available out of the archives.
Well, production statistics might be at a provincial level, which doesn't really tell you about a particular city or region.
Exactly. And those kinds of things are available in the provincial archives. The provincial archives have them. I've worked in some of them. You can get to that level of information. It's just at what price, right? Right. So essentially that's the kind of thing, and I don't need to talk anymore about this, but that's the kind of thing, trying to kind of push on the idea of, resisting the idea of simply accepting the broad claims that are made about the Russian economy and its geography, its kind of distribution, its kind of spatial distribution, and try to think a little bit more carefully about the units that were used to capture information and the units through which we can look at this information. There are the polygons that are the provinces, there are the rivers that are lines. This data also has the location of every wharf that was in use along these rivers. So if, one of the important things I think one could finally say is that, yeah, sure, the Volga is really important. And in part it's because there's one really important river port. The city of Kazan is massively important for the Russian economy. And it's because of Kazan, almost all of the volume that's going along the river is focused on going in and out of Kazan. Does that really have, what kind of trickle-down effect does that have for the smaller ports, the smaller little wharves that are along the Volga? I think it's it's obviously a very different story there. So being able to kind of think about the particular spaces of a river, kind of parsing all of that out, I think is actually really important for understanding how the Russian economy works. And so that's it. That's one of the things I've been doing with all of this, spatial and statistical data. And I think one of my biggest takeaways has been that there is so much to learn at so many scales of Russian history through applying kind of very rudimentary, basic historical, GIS methods. It's kind of exhilarating and very daunting as well. It is a labor-intensive kind of work, and one never knows if the labor is going to end up revealing something that you didn't know before you started. So this is one of those cases where I think there are a few little payoffs that are actually pretty interesting that I can really work with, but it doesn't always happen. Anyway.
Question. So I understand this about rivers, but what was the road infrastructure like at that time? There must have been some trade. I mean, sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points isn't going to be going down a river and up another. There must be some road infrastructure.
Absolutely. If I can, here's world map. You can see it. I have, that part is up on world map. I actually don't have the rivers there, but you can get a quick look at what the road system looks like. I'll get rid of all the villages. For at least this is the road network actually remains pretty stable throughout the 19th century. So even though this is 1820s, this is a pretty good approximation of what the road network is like. The roads are maintained by different parts of the kind of imperial and local governments. But this is what the road network looks like. And we have great information for the entire late 18th century to the end of the empire. Itineraries of exactly how long it would be expected to take to move from one post station to the next post station, how many horses you would be able to have access to depending on your social status, how much you'd have to pay to use each of those horses in fees, and then you can kind of extrapolate how many bribes you'd have to pay to the people who are running the post stations. So I have the roads and I have the rivers. I haven't yet put them together. That's another stage of kind of network analysis that I would like to do, because you're absolutely right. In fact, a lot of the year of Russia is pretty frozen over, and that dramatically changes the way things move through the empire. But all of the data, the bureaucrats capture that for the rivers, for the roads. They actually break the travel along roads. They break down into seasons, so you pay different fees and you have a different rate of speed in each of the seasons. Yeah.
Is there anything important or interesting about the directions that the rivers flow? And is there anything that you feel like if you were able to render the directionality of actually which ways the rivers were flowing on the map, that would somehow bring out another part of the story, or not?
Yeah, I think so. I do have maps that show the rivers organized by kind of river systems, by watersheds, which are really interesting, because they kind of create these kind of geographical jurisdictions in a way that inform the way imperial bureaucrats then carve out administrative spaces in ways that are really interesting and not obvious if you're just looking at a map of the provinces. So there's that, and the other part of it is that most half of Russian rivers flow to the north. A lot of them flow into the White Sea, which makes them incredibly useless. And you know, the Volga flows into the Caspian, which is marginally useful. The Dnieper and the Don flow into the Black Sea, which is only useful if you can convince the Ottomans and then the Turks to let you go through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. So one of the important things to understand about Russian river traffic in the 19th century is that it's all about finding ways for goods to travel upriver. A lot of Polish grain comes from the Polish provinces and comes down to Odessa and then goes out, and they become, you know, feeding the breadbasket of Europe kind of thing. But a whole lot of energy goes into, and the barge haulers, that's why I started with the barge haulers, getting goods upriver as far as they could toward Moscow, toward Kiev, toward places like that. And then once you get it upriver along the southern rivers, then it can go downriver along the Vistula and the Dvina into the Polish ports, the Baltic ports, where you can actually sell things to people who have ships and money to buy them. So there's a lot of accidents of geography that make travel unique in Russia.
So following up on that question, your data is a lot about material goods and production and shipment.
Yeah.
And the networks that you've developed in GIS, I was wondering if you've studied anything about mobility and migration. And that was one question, like movements of people and how this is reflected in data or what you found out. And then the second question was actually about that painting, which I think was painted after the emancipation of the serfs.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if there's some aspect in the painting or in the social change after the emancipation of the serfs that led to more like sort of drudge occupations of people being displaced from their traditional like village life.
Okay, two different
but they're
questions.
both about people moving around.
Yeah.
What happens to them?
Yep. So mobility, on that, the two things that so far I have, one actually has to do with the post-road itineraries, because that's one way of figuring out not how people actually traveled, but how on paper they were supposed to travel, kind of rates of mobility through the empire. The other thing that there are lots of ways to kind of get at that. None of them are really perfect. Another way is through looking at from a local perspective, local sources that talk about markets and fairs and who would come to them, how far away people would come from, what kinds of, because distance isn't always the important thing. It's whether there's a road or a river that would allow someone to get to a particular fair in a particular time of year. But that can be a kind of good unexpected source for figuring out kind of the distance a merchant might be expected to travel in the Russian Empire. The other thing that we have laws that the Russian Empire produced that stipulated exactly how far a peasant was allowed to travel. So you know that someone who is a serf on a particular estate, they could only travel whatever it was, 20 kilometers essentially from their estate without further, they need a passport for that. They need a serious passport beyond that. So when you're thinking about the possibilities for mobility, they're very much, at least on paper, constrained by social status, right? Which is a really interesting thing. Now, of course, there's all kinds of, how it really worked in the real world. There's that, but that's one of the ways to get at that question. And then the question about, what was the other question?
Like the change after the emancipation.
Oh, right, after emancipation, right. So emancipation, it's another thing that in the short answer to that question is that emancipation happens over the course of the 1860s, and it happens on paper, and actual impact on the lives of a lot of peasants isn't necessarily great in economic or material terms for a long time. And for some peasants, it is there's a disadvantage involved in the fact that the social contract between serf and noble landowner, such as it was, is broken, And now they have to go out and do other things like become barge haulers. Yeah, and burlaki, people who have to help navigate and go into, work in, not so much, crafts aren't so bad, but this kind of work is pretty typical. The short answer is that all depends on where you are in the empire and whether you're in a slightly industrialized part of the empire or in a more agricultural part of the empire. That is the biggest indicator on whether or not emancipation changed your life as a peasant.
Well, wasn't the passport law that you cited created in part to keep the peasants from leaving the land?
Yeah, but that was much earlier. Essentially, that's part of the encirclement of the peasants that happens over the course of the 16th and middle of the 17th century. So it's to prevent any form of peasant mobility. Yes, because you want people to stay on a particular estate, stay working it, so that the elites who own that estate have a steady source of food and clothing and horses so that they can go and fight the Tsars' wars. That's essentially what happens.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell, I know it's kind of horrifying to hear myself like boil it down like that, but yeah, don't quote me. That's all you need to know. Yeah, exactly, Wendy.
A few things. First is that I'm glad that you did derive the watershed boundaries, catchments, right?
Yep.
So do you also have any population data?
Mm-hmm.
You do, and probably by administrative units. Then,
Yes.
Right. It would be really interesting to translate that population data from the admin boundaries into the watershed boundaries, so that your trade and load, like all those measurements along rivers, could then be translated into also watershed.
Watershed, that's a great idea. The only problem, so this is where, and I'd love if anyone has ideas about this is where I run into the problem of the fact that this fantastic high quality spatial data that I have for administrative boundaries only gets me so far, because the really great demographic information, I have it for the 1840s, which isn't so different from the 1820s. But all the best data comes in the second half of the 19th century, and a lot of the provincial boundaries change in the interim.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, they become a rough measure. Thinking about watersheds might actually solve that problem in a sense, because
Exactly.
yeah.
And also, years back, when Guo Pinghuang, I don't know whether you know him.
Yeah.
When he was here, he worked with Peter to redistribute historical population based on a model. And one important variable was hydrology, and of course, elevation, farmable land, and market activities too. So based on the different variables, they were playing with the much more aggregated population census data back into smaller units, and then calibrated that using market data to see whether that makes sense.
Wow.
So I believe they have a manuscript. I don't know whether it's published yet. Something you might want to think along that line is that how do you redistribute historical population based on your need and also based on the different factors that make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could create a population model based on
that.
geographical factors, and
Exactly.
other
That's
economic
what they
factors, then you can use that to reallocate from
Yeah,
province A, which is now been split between B and C,
exactly.
Right.
and
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
because of the characteristics. The
And-
problem is you can say, oh, it's all even, but the reality is everyone lives
Oh yeah.
in the west
Yeah.
side
Yep.
rather than the
Yeah.
east side
Yeah.
for reasons that.
And then you could also then compare different administrative units through different time
Mm-hmm.
by redistributing it through the similar model, but into any unit, like
Mm-hmm.
uniform units independent from the admin.
Yep.
My second
Yep.
question
Great.
is that you mentioned about the ice melting
Yeah.
date on segments of river
Mhm.
throughout
Yep.
multiple years. That would be a wonderful data set for climate change study or something else. Do you have that available for others to look into?
Yeah, I don't know if that's one that's finished yet, but as soon as it's finished, yes.
Do you also have
Sure.
the frozen date too?
Ooh, I don't think I've seen that.
I
I have the number of days it's I have the average number of days that each of the measured segments is frozen.
Okay, average 2 years?
I'm trying to think what increments of time they captured that. It's every kind of 2 or 3 years, but it has the average number of days frozen, or the number of days frozen every year in the data. I think I've calculated averages, and it has the melt date, whatever the technical
Well, then you
term
can
for that is.
backtrack.
And then you can
that.
backtrack.
Oh, that's great.
You can backtrack.
Yeah, I can imagine that data would be really valuable for a lot of different purposes.
Yeah. Well.
If you make it available some point of time.
Yes, I'll add that to my to-do list. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Of course, now I'll be coming knocking on your door and asking for you.
Right.
How did you determine the segments of the rivers? Break those up? Was it by the book or hydrologically or
in the
by
spatial data?
province?
That was broken up anytime there was a segment that intersected with another segment. We broke it into segments so that we could then go back and merge segments that actually belong to the same river and those that didn't. So there's
So it was really,
lots
it was
and lots
hydrologically by tributaries intersecting the main, so anywhere two came together. Okay.
anywhere where two came together. Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot, I think there's a lot more segments than there probably even needed to be. I think that there are segments, trying to think if there are any segments that are that exist for other reasons. I'd have to go back and look, but I think it's only at intersection points. Yeah.
And then the historic book that, you know, a bunch of your data came from, how were those segments? I mean, how did you match those? Or was it like?
Those are given by
longitude?
river. No. So those are given by river name, and it gives, and it's also broken down by by province. So a river that goes through multiple provinces will occur multiple times in the data when the table is organized by province, but it doesn't break it down into further segments unless it's talking. So it talks about wharves are mentioned individually. And kind of the segment of, you know, ice melt, that kind of thing. It's not actually defined by segment. It's defined by stations where those measurements were taken.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, just curious because it, you know, there's all kinds of ways you can divide up the river, you know, river system, and it sounds like you have several different types in your input and your resulting data, complicated by Russia being so flat.
Yes.
And you don't have nice, coherent, you know, drainage basins. They're probably really weird shapes that.
Yeah, when you get toward the delta of a river, even way farther up, yeah, you do get very, very strange shapes. It's very difficult to reconstruct with any confidence exactly. Yeah, I mean, there are ways for major rivers, but yeah.
Yeah, just trying to grasp all the challenges
yes.
you have here.
I mean, I think what is absolutely essential in working on historical GIS, at least for this part of the world and for going back just as far as I do, is that you have to, it's something I need to do. I need to articulate exactly what my tolerance is for inaccuracy and vagueness,
Yeah.
you know, because you can't avoid it. So I think that kind of really thinking carefully about what the standard should be, what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. You know, it's the kind of the whole principle behind deciding to use an atlas from the 1820s as a foundation, as a starting point for thinking about how the space of the empire was organized. You know, you could definitely say that makes no sense, and it makes a lot more sense to go kind of work backward from contemporary accurate cartographic information and kind of recreate things, and that works too. But the idea of simply being interested in treating this as a kind of coherent source was really, really interesting to me. And I was really curious to see how inaccurate or how it would match up, you know, and it's pretty good. But adopting that has forced me to adopt, you know, to have to always insert the caveat that I work in a very 5 to 10 kilometer off world of GIS. Yeah, Wendy.
Given that accuracy tolerance, I wonder what would you find if you compare the hydraulic network of modern day
Mhm.
Russia with what you have now.
Mhm.
There is data set, probably not to the level of granularity,
Right.
but at least the major rivers that you could have.
Yep.
When you augment the distortion of the projection best you can, kind of see the differences between the two, and
Yeah.
may give you a sense of what change was really the natural course, and the river change course. So they're not staying in one spot throughout, centuries. But on the other hand, what was just introduced by technology of cartography or survey, and whether that impacts your conclusions one way or another.
Yeah.
Some of the GIS tools might give you a rough cut of comparison, and then you could zoom in from there to see.
Yep. I absolutely. I've looked. I mean, I've done some comparison of the data that I found for major river systems. Again, I haven't. There might be better data out there, and I just haven't worked on it. And it actually compares relatively favorably with the data that we extracted from the 1820s. The courses of the rivers remain pretty stable, and they're off, but by about the same amount most of the way through. It's kind of a good rough measure, which I don't know how useful that is to know. It's kind of useful to know that. But yeah, it's certainly another kind of way of working backward in time. I just haven't, I'd love to talk to, I have to talk to more Soviet specialists too. I mean, there's so many interventions in the hydrographic landscape of the 20th century. They're just, they're major, a lot of dams. Yeah. It would be a really interesting project actually to, harass a graduate student into taking on,
Yeah, connect the Volga to the Black Sea.
The Volga?
The Volga Canal.
Well, Peter the Great had a great plan for that. I actually have the plans for it. He wanted to build a canal connecting the Volga to the Don, and he had plans drawn up and everything. People start digging a canal that.
But he didn't do it. When did they actually do
it? That canal, I don't think ever got built to connect. Maybe there is now. There might be one now, actually. I don't know about that one in particular. That's not one of the major works of heroism in the Soviet period. The White Sea canals. Yeah, exactly. But that's another thing that, a lot of the Stalin's ideas, they're like lifted entirely from Peter the Great or from Catherine. They all had these ideas. They had the plans for all of this stuff. They just didn't have the ability to make them happen. And then, 20th century happens.
I was just wondering, did you have all this interesting aspects you've teased out of the data. Have you got anything on culture and ethnography? Because I should think that the empire being so big that there's a lot of sort of regionality of where people who speak different languages are and so on, and ethnic groups.
We have great that luckily, it was an empire, so they collected all kinds of data. I have population by confession and ethnicity, particularly in the later part of the 18th century. Ethnicity defined by what language you spoke.
And those could be coded to the villages, or they are?
To the village, no. Yes, if I went back, all of that data is there in the archives. But in the published form, they publish tables. Down to the the villages for the provinces I work on in the southern part of the empire, yeah.
That would be
you do get it at the village level. In fact, one of the recent PhD I've been working with actually just coded all of that data for Crimea at the village level. Yeah, so that and all of that data was compiled starting in the 1860s and 1870s. So yeah, you could do it at that level. It's just again, it's a matter of manpower or OCR power or whatever. Abby Fine Reader teaching it to do all that, right?
Can I piggyback on that? Actually, I'm wondering if you have any way of mapping the possible mobility of different categories of people. Obviously, serfs is easy, but I'm thinking of Jews. I'm thinking of Tatars. From what I understand, after Kazan is taken, they're not allowed to live by major rivers anymore. I'm thinking like all different ethnic groups. If you could get an idea of like, okay, would you have a traktir where people would suddenly be speaking Urdu somewhere because there's some weird unexpected thing of ethnic capture of a particular job. I'm thinking here also of Vladimir Lapin's work on the sites and sounds of St. Petersburg, where it turns out that there's like certain jobs that only Finns did and certain jobs that only Germans did that are unexpected. Like all these chimney sweeps were Finnish for some reason. And I'm just wondering if you happen to, if this would allow you, this might not allow you to, but I'm wondering if you have that sort of data and if you would have these unexpected moments of like, oh, it turns out that all of the, within a certain range of Odessa, everything, all the traktirs, all the pubs are run by Jews, and then like if you go to this somewhere in the Volga, it might all be Germans or what have you.
All
Yeah.
the cab drivers are Nigerian.
What do you think? How I don't. Okay, so I don't have level at that granularity, data at that granularity for the empire. I have lots of information like about that for the southern part of Russia. Yes, and I can tell you the particular towns, and there's lots. One of the great sources for that is the collection of imperial law, where they have laws that will say, Greeks can only live in this particular town, and you will have Karaite Jews here. So you could actually, that might be the easiest way to go back and recreate a lot of that kind of thing at the level of, the really interesting level of kind of individual traktir, a place, an eating establishment or a drinking establishment, places where social interaction would happen. I'm not exactly sure how I could go about reconstructing that. That's a really interesting question. The only way I could get at it in a kind of rough cut way would be to have the information on ethnicity or confession layered with the locations of those kinds of establishments. That would be a first kind of cut at it. But I can't think of documents that would, at that really specific level. I'm sure it's possible. I can't think how to do it without going to each individual provincial archive, because that's how I've done it I can do it for Crimea because I've done that. So I can tell you how many coffee houses there were in Bakhchisarai, and I can tell you how many Karaite Jews lived there and where they lived, and all that kind of thing, that specificity for the part of the world that I know best. Just need a major NEH grant to hire, 200 graduate students to go out and do all the archival work, and then we can map all of that.
Another question here.
So just have a small question. So you were showing in terms of the data that you do have and something called learned
Societies.
What is that? How good is it?
Научное общество, yeah. So this is a learned society. There's one that is established under Catherine the Great, and then they grow from there. It's basically the story of the 1830s and 40s and beyond. Learned societies such as the Geographical Society, local chapters of geographical societies, archival societies, societies for the lovers of antiquity, societies for lovers of literature. So these are kind of, these are places of association for generally members of the elite, although as you move through the 19th century, you get kind of sort of middle-classy type people who are involved, educated kind of people who are involved in those societies. And they play a very important role in producing knowledge about the empire, particularly about cultural activity, in particular about cultural activity. So the spread of those societies kind of correlates with the production of sources that then would allow you to, to think about that. So
would it be kind of like a measure of human capital or some sort of by doing civil society kind of thing?
Yeah, it could be a rough cut of civil society. Civil society is a very fraught term in Russian history because some say, there's no such thing, there's no, public sphere. Others say, yes, there was. We just have to, using those terms isn't so productive in Russian history. But yeah, that's one of the reasons why I was interested in mapping that is because it, here's a rough cut of, and it's both civil society, but it's also a measure of the investment of the imperial government in certain parts of the empire. So if I have a visualization where it's done by kind of society. So you can see that in, you know, the decade after a particular area is taken into the empire, like Central Asia, you have the opening of particular kinds of learned societies. You know, there's a chapter of the Geographical Society and there's a chapter of the Ethnographic Society, but they're not really going to have a chapter of the Lovers of Antiquity, you know, in there. You know, so there's definitely that kind of imperial colonizing, you know, colonial knowledge story also going on there. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Kelly, thank you very much for presenting. That was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you. Yeah, just need lots of laborers. I need barge haulers.
Yes, you need a lot of words.
I had no idea you did so much on rivers. I knew you did
Mhm.